This is the video review for World War II. This is part 2. So there are 2 other videos that come before this. There's a video on the causes of World War II, and there's also World War II part 1. We're picking up where that one left off. All right, so basically, if you remember from part 1 of the video, I showed you a map of the European continent where it was almost entirely red. And that was because Hitler had been successful in taking over either directly or indirectly through creating alliances. He had control over almost all of the European continent. So naturally, even though the Allies, even if the Allies won, it was going to be a lot of work to put the continent back in order after the war was over. Because as I mentioned too, it became pretty obvious after Hitler invaded invaded the Soviet Union. It severely weakened his forces. In addition, with the victory on D-Day, it had opened up a 2-front war on Germany. So, the Allies knew for a while, even before Germany surrendered on May 7th, it was clear just even months before that, that it was just a matter of when, not if, but when the Allies would win. Similarly with Japan, once Germany was weakened and all of the Allies would be able to focus their attention on Japan, they knew, and with the battle at Midway won, and again, it was just a matter of time before the Allies would be able to defeat Japan, well before August the 15th when Japan surrendered. So in keeping with this, even before the Allies had officially won World War II, they wanted to meet together to discuss what would be the next steps after World War II was over, how they were going to set the continent back in order after everything that had happened. So there were 2 meetings, one in February of 1945 and later one in July of 1945. February 1945 meeting was known as Yalta. That is held in the midst of the war. So they were still fighting in Europe and in Asia. And at this point in Yalta, there was still a lot of concern because even after Hitler would be defeated in Europe, and it was clear that Hitler was on the ropes and it was pretty easy to be defeated, there was a big concern about conquering Japan. If you remember, Japan has a very significant geographic advantage over Germany. If you think of the geography of Japan versus the geography of Germany, remember, Germany is located in the middle of the European continent. It's easy to get to, easy to conquer with an army. Japan is very different. Japan, if you can recall, is an archipelago. It's an island. And island nations are traditionally very hard to conquer, very hard to take an army into an island nation. So at the Yalta conference, there was discussion about that they knew that an invasion of the Japanese homeland would be very difficult. As far as location is concerned, the closest allied nation to Japan was the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union would be the natural place to use as a base of operations. So there was a lot of concern that the Allies really had to depend on the USSR's support and cooperation when the focus would shift entirely to the war in Asia. However, remember, the Allies of the United States, France, Britain, they got along pretty well. But if you remember, the USSR was not only joined the Allies after it had been betrayed by Germany. Stalin did not start the war on the Allies' side. At the start of the war, he had had an agreement with Hitler. And it was also, the USSR was at this time, the only communist country in the world. And the Western powers considered communists to be the enemy. So there was a lot of tension, and there had always been tension between these allies, even though they fought on the same side in the war, right? Because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? They had gotten along because they all saw Hitler as a mutual enemy. Once Hitler's out of the picture, once Japan is going to be out of the picture, they're not necessarily friends after the war. So this was what was the concern. At Yalta, they all have to play nice. They knew they needed Stalin to be there. They needed Stalin as a friend. They needed him as an ally after Germany would be defeated. In July of 1945 at the Potsdam Conference, very different story. By July of 1945, they knew that they didn't need the USSR as a friend, and the relationship between the Allies is going to change, and Potsdam is considered the start of the Cold War. But we're going to go into the reasons for that. All right, first let's take a look at the Yalta Conference. The Yalta Conference is a meeting of the big three. You should recognize these people. To the left is Churchill. In the middle is FDR. Remember, Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain. Person in the middle, that's FDR. He was the President of the United States. And to the right is Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. At the Yalta Conference, there was a few, they had started to make agreements. These are the three major powers in the war. They decided to form the United Nations, which would be an improvement over the League of Nations. Right? The League of Nations had a lot of weaknesses. It had weaknesses because it didn't have its own armed force to make agreements. It didn't have all countries as members. Every decision made had to be agreed upon by all the members. The United Nations was formed and in a way to solve a lot of those issues. So in the United Nations, for example, there are United Nations peacekeepers. The United Nations has its own armed force. In the United Nations, all members of the world were, almost all the countries of the world are part of the United Nations. So it had much greater membership. The other big change was that decisions by the United Nations have to be agreed upon by the Security Council, not by the entire membership. And only a few countries, there's some permanent members like the US, Britain, France, the USSR, China, they're permanent members, and then other members come in and out of the Security Council. But suffice to say, the United Nations is formed, again, like the League of Nations, with the goal of maintaining peace and keeping peace in the world, but it improved. It was looking to solve some of the problems in the League of Nations. All right, next, like we said, the USSR promises free elections in Eastern Europe. Throughout the war, the USSR had invaded the nations of Eastern Europe. And after the war, he said, no problem, we'll leave these countries to be independent, like they were after World War I. There was a decision made to split up Germany, and this is kind of a normal thing, that after you beat a country, you're not going to beat somebody and then turn your back on them and walk away. You need to keep an eye on them for a while. You need to keep an eye on the country and maintain order in the country after a war of this severity. So there was discussion about occupying Germany for a time, and there was a decision made that they would split Germany into pieces, and each of these allied powers would occupy a different section of Germany. And finally, there was discussion of the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials were because by this time, everyone knew about the concentration camps that Hitler had opened. And this horror that, was just so obscene, there was this acknowledgement that there had to be punishment. That, everyone knows during a war, people are going to die. That's standard, right? You go into a war, people are citizens, innocent bystanders, whatever. Civilians, soldiers, a lot of people are going to die during a war. But the concentration camps was something beyond that. This was something that was just a crime against nature. This was obscene what had gone on. And so there was a decision made that there would be a trial held. and that the actions of the Nazis in opening and maintaining these concentration camps, that these actions would be punished. And that was discussion of the Nuremberg trials. So all of these things were decided on at Yalta. And like I said, there was a strong effort made for the three nations to get along. FDR wanted peace between all three of them, and they wanted to work together. As I said, after the Yalta Conference, however, there had been, the reason why there was a need to keep peace was because they knew they needed the Soviet Union's help to defeat Japan, right? They knew they needed the Soviet Union's help to defeat Japan if they needed to invade the Japanese homeland. But what happens is during the Potsdam Conference, in the very early days of the Potsdam Conference, America had what was called the Manhattan Project, and we had developed a nuclear bomb. And once the decision was made to use the nuclear bomb on Japan, there was no need for an invasion of the Japanese homeland. Therefore, there was no need for the USSR's assistance. Once the United States had a nuclear bomb, we did not need the USSR's aid. We didn't need the USSR's help. So therefore, there was no need for us to get along anymore. We had the nuclear bomb. And you can see these are some pictures from the bomb dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The top left is what was called a shadow. When the nuclear bomb was dropped, a lot of people were vaporized, and shadows were kept because of the high heat. So this is a permanent shadow. This is a permanent shadow. So at the moment the bomb was dropped, there was a little girl playing jump rope, and all that's left behind was her shadow, and that's a permanent shadow left. On the top right, you can see some of the burn damage done to people from the high heat. These people, somebody like this, they're not going to survive. They're not going to survive for long. Between the radiation and this level of this kind of burn, with these kinds of severe third-degree burns, you just don't survive that. The bottom left, you can see just the unbelievable damage. These cities were wiped out. And remember, these are cities. They're not filled with soldiers. This is filled with normal people. This is, and yes, the United States did drop down flyers and said, hey, we're going to drop a bomb. You should escape. You should leave. By definition, I mean, if our enemy in a war dropped any kind of communication to us, it's not like we would open it up and be like, oh, well, of course I'm going to believe this. You know what I'm saying? It could be lies. So you might ignore it because of that. You might also ignore it. Even if you 100% believed it, it doesn't mean you necessarily have the money or the opportunity to leave. I mean, we see that all the time with people. I mean, look, we have hurricanes and floods coming, natural disasters that strike parts of the country. And every time we do, how many times do you see news reports of people who drown in their homes or are hurt or trapped? And it's because they choose to stay in their homes during a storm, right? And they know that's happening, and they absolutely know the storm is coming, but they're like, no, I'm just going to ride it out. So the thought that people would just naturally, have the opportunity to escape, that's never going to happen. There's always going to be people who are left behind. So a lot of civilians were killed in these explosions. As you can see, with this level of damage, there's no way people survived. And, at the bottom middle, that's what they call a mushroom cloud, and it gets that name from the mushroom shape that you see after a nuclear bomb is dropped. So like I said, you have to know the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's how you pronounce those two names. You must know them. Once the nuclear bomb is dropped, once the atomic bomb is dropped on those two cities, it is clear that Japan cannot continue fighting. I mean, these bombs, this is, from one moment to the next, entire cities are wiped out. If they didn't surrender, we could, drop bombs like crazy. There was nothing, Japan was powerless against this kind of power. So they were forced to surrender. The emperor was forced to go on the radio. He was forced to make it clear to his people that he was not a god. And Japan was forced to adopt a new constitution, to introduce more democracy. So the military dictatorship was over. In addition, Japan was forced to demilitarize. So even till today, Japan does not maintain an armed forces. They they've chosen to demilitarize. All right. So as I said, I'm going to go back to the first slide. Yalta Conference happens in 1945, and again, this is a meeting between the big three in acknowledgement, knowing that they needed to stay friends with the Soviet Union because they're going to need the Soviet Union's help to conquer Japan. That's in February at the Yalta Conference. At the Potsdam Conference, however, that's different. At the Potsdam Conference, the United States knows it has the nuclear bomb. It can win World War II without the Soviet Union's help. So it's a very different environment. In addition, President FDR had died, and there was a new president, okay? All right? This is President, if you can see, on the left is Joseph Stalin. On the right is Churchill. In the center, that is President Truman. Okay, so President Truman takes office after FDR. And President Truman has a very different feeling about the Soviet Union. He hates communists. He does not trust the Soviet Union. And he wants to, and he has no interest in being allies with them. And that's why the Potsdam Conference is considered the start of the Cold War, because the relationship between the West and the Soviet Union gets bad. This is where it starts going downhill. At the Potsdam Conference, the Soviet Union makes it clear that they will not allow Eastern Europe to have free elections. This is where Stalin tells them that they want to have a presence in Eastern Europe because, according to the Soviet Union, they need to maintain a buffer zone around the Soviet Union. Remember, a buffer zone. This idea that if the West decides to attack the Soviet Union, they won't be able to get to the Soviet Union without passing through Eastern Europe first. So that's why it acts as a buffer. It acts like a, like a bumper. It gives them space from attack, that this is protection for the Soviet Union. All right. So as you can see from this map, the Soviet Union is on the right. It is in red. These other red, you can see this very thick white line. That thick white line is known as the Iron Curtain. And that is the nickname given to the border between the countries of the West, which are democracies, versus the countries of the East, which are communist. What happens is, after World War II, Stalin says he will not allow Eastern Europe to have free elections. It's not going to happen. So these countries of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, they are forced to have communist governments that answer to the Soviet Union. Okay, they must maintain communist governments, and they must take direction from the Soviet Union. Okay, even though they're technically independent countries, they answer to the Soviet Union, almost like a protectorate in a way. If you think about, if you think back to imperialism, although the Soviet Union would never call it imperialist, because imperialism is something that capitalist countries do, and they are in fact communist, so they would never call it that. But like I said, politically, the Soviet Union dominates these countries. The exception, Yugoslavia, technically it's not within the Iron Curtain because Yugoslavia actually chooses to have a communist country. But anyway, so these countries of Eastern Europe are known, they are behind the Iron Curtain, which is again that dividing line between the democracies of the West and the communist countries of the East. These countries of Eastern Europe are known as the buffer zone, again, with the idea that if the countries of the West wanted to invade the Soviet Union, these countries would act as a buffer. They would block them. They wouldn't be able to attack the Soviet Union directly. And they're also known as satellite nations. Satellite nations. Satellite basically meaning like it revolves around the Soviet Union, like a satellite. Like it's just focused and concentrated on making the Soviet Union happy. These nations are satellites. They follow the Soviet Union. All right, another topic you need to talk about in World War II is obviously the Holocaust. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it. There's many movies and TV shows and things about it. Just a horrific event. All right, so let's go through it. First, one of the things that we need to talk about is the idea of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is prejudice against Jews, okay? So if somebody is being anti-Semitic, they are showing prejudice against Jews, okay? Negative feelings, all right? And this is something that has been going on for a really, really long time. I mean, it continues today. I mean, if you guys saw the videos of that Nazi rally in Charlottesville, they were saying, you will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. This was one of the chants that these Nazis in Charlottesville was screaming out. So that's a form of anti-Semitism. So it continues today. But back then, but anti-Semitism been going on, since, you think about it in ninth grade, with the Black Death, they blamed Jews. And there had been the pogroms of Russia where they had kicked out Jews. There had been the Dreyfus affair during World War I, where people of France had been showing anti-Semitism. It's been going on throughout history. Obviously, the Holocaust is another just an extreme example of this kind of anti-Jewish feeling. All right. Anyway, when Hitler takes power, he passes what is known as the Nuremberg Laws. Okay, the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws were laws that were specifically designed to hurt Jews. They were laws that prevented Jews from opening certain businesses. There were laws that prevented Jews from hiring young German women to work with them, things like that. Again, it's kind of anti-Semitic laws. So laws specifically designed to hurt the social, political, and economic power of Jews living in Germany. And what we have around this time, so even before the Holocaust starts, even before people are shipped off to concentration camps, you have the passing of laws which are anti-Jew, and then you have what's known as the start of the Holocaust, which was Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht literally translates into night of broken glass. Think of crystal. Like, have you ever seen shattered glass where it gets sparkly, almost like a crystal? You can think of it that way. So Kristallnacht is considered the start of the Holocaust. This is a moment where troops come in and start bashing in the windows and start destroying Jewish businesses. And this is where it goes beyond just laws that are anti-Semitic to direct action where it starts becoming violent, where the anti-Semitism turns violent. That's the beginning of Kristallnacht. So the Holocaust is actually, you can kind of think of it in two parts. At first, there's a big push to just get the Jews out of Germany. They want them to leave. But what ends up happening is that many of the Jews can't get out. Other countries won't accept them. In addition, it's very hard to leave everything you've worked for, your money, your connections, what have you. It's hard to leave that behind. Some people wanted to ride it out, whatever it is. So they're subject to a lot of prejudice. They're subject, this is where you have to wear the yellow star on your clothing and things like that. But then, and there's a lot of, like I said, kind of anti-Jewish feeling. You start having Jews being brought to work camps. So that, they're pushed into ghettos, Jewish ghettos, where they're separated from other people. They're put into workhouses so that they'll have to work. But what ends up happening is that eventually it's going to move from just trying to get Jews out of Germany, trying to take away their stuff and force them to work or force them to leave. It goes into part two, which is known as the final solution. And this is where there is this effort to just exterminate Jews. This is the mass murder. This is where it's no longer about work camps. This is where you load trains up with Jews, you take them to a camp, and the only purpose of the camp is to kill as many people as quickly and as efficiently as possible. All right, so this is where you get into the showers where they're told they're taking a shower, but instead poison gas is released. And so you'd have an entire room full of people just killed, taken out of the room, and then a new set of people are put into that same shower room. And the goal is to kill off as many Jews as possible, and then all of their land, all of their property would be taken in by the Germans. And they do make a lot of money. There's a big discussion about all of the gold and all of the looting taken from all the Jews. All of their property is taken by the Germans. Some of it has been recovered. Much of it hasn't. It was put into Swiss banks, so there's a lot still going on with that. You should be familiar with the term genocide. That is literally translates into an idea that you are trying to wipe people off, that you're literally trying to kill off an entire race or group of people. That's what a genocide is. You're literally your goal is to just kill them all. Again, not in genocide, like I said, when you go to war, there's many people who are killed in war. That's one thing. But a genocide is, no, I'm just here to just kill you all, just destroy you all. Again, please bear in mind that the Holocaust did not just affect Jews. There were other people who were targeted by the Nazis. Obviously, the Jews were the primary target, but communists ended up in concentration camps. Homosexuals wound up in concentration camps. Romani people, the kind of un-PC kind of nickname. They're sometimes referred to as gypsies, which is a very derogatory term. It's a negative term. But it's actually the Romani people who were there, disabled people, many other groups ended up in concentration camps. But one of the, like I said, the Jews were the primary target. 6 million Jews were killed in the concentration camps. Basically, the Jews of Europe are almost all wiped out. I think like I forget, it was 1/3, maybe more. But anyway, remember there are multiple concentration camps. Auschwitz is one of the most famous. That's the picture on the right where it says "Ich bin mach frei." I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but that literally translates into "work makes you free." Like I said, not just killed, but also medical experiments. I mean, these people were tortured, starved. It's just horrific. Acts of, this is just one of the most clear-cut, what they say is a violation of human rights, that their human rights, the rights that all human beings should have to just live, is violated. So you may remember, the Holocaust is not the first genocide. The first genocide that we've ever talked about was the Armenian genocide, and that was committed against, the Turks committed that against the Christian Armenian people. And if you remember, there was a discussion, supposedly Hitler had made a comment when somebody said, hey, you'll never get away with killing all these people. Hitler said, well, nobody stopped the Armenian genocide. So that's something that people often mention, that activists today say, every time you don't act when there's a genocide going on, every time you let one pass, it opens the door for it to happen again. And again, you need to understand that more than 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And it is after the Holocaust that there is a big movement. There's a movement known as Zionism. Zionism is a movement for Jews to have their own homeland. This idea that Jews had always been subject to prejudice, always been subject to anti-Semitism, and that one way for Jews to be safe would be if they had their own country, their own homeland, where they knew they could have their own government and have a safe place. Zionism, the movement of Zionism, had existed for a really long time. It's dated to the 1800s, where you have the Dreyfus Affair and things like that. But obviously, after the Holocaust, the calls for Zionism, the call for a Jewish homeland, get much louder and gets more international backing, and that's where you're going to see the State of Israel will be formed after World War II. All right. By the way, people often think about Hitler when, who's the most evil guy on earth, and people say Hitler, which is fine. You can absolutely say that. He's pretty cold-blooded and crazy. But when it comes to straight body counts, he's actually number 3. If you're just going by body count, he's actually 3. The 30 million people that Hitler is said to have killed is kind of a drop in the bucket. If you remember, Joseph Stalin actually has higher numbers. If you went through the totalitarianism presentation between the Holodomor, which was the Armenian sorry, I'm saying Armenian genocide. No, that was the where he killed off all of the people from the Ukrainian people that when they did not agree to his efforts to collectivize. Many of the Ukrainian people were killed. In addition, he had the Great Purge where he killed many people. So Joseph Stalin actually has a higher body count. But both of them have a much smaller body count than Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is going to kill 60 million people. We're going to take a look at that during when I go over the Chinese Communist Revolution. So again, though, I mean, when it comes to evil, he can definitely be the most evil because the way he killed people and his approach and how it was carried out and the cold-bloodedness of it, certainly that's a judgment call. We've studied a lot of these other people too. King Leopold, you should remember him from the Scramble for Africa. Tojo from Japan. I have a presentation on my website where we look at the war, the Sino-Japanese War, the rape of Nanjing, and many of the actions that Japan took in Asia in the midst of World War II and even before that. He's got a pretty big body count. The Ottoman Empire of 2 million, that dates back to the Armenian genocide, which we also studied. And later we're going to study Cambodia. And so you're also going to learn about Pol Pot. So we've studied all of these people, unfortunately. So there's a lot of bad guys out there. All right. So yeah, I happened to mention the rape of Nanjing earlier. Here it is again. As I said, when Japan, I mentioned multiple times, both when I went over the Industrial Revolution as well as when I went over imperialism. I talked about the fact that when Japan goes through the Meiji Restoration and decides to rapidly industrialize, one of the issues it has is it lacks raw materials. And so therefore, because it lacks raw materials, they find that they must imperialize to industrialize. Remember that? They're going to imperialize to industrialize. And its imperialism starts before World War II, but actually merges with it. It starts before the war, but it's going to continue throughout the war. And its aggression in Asia is part of this act of imperialism. What happens is when Japan takes over China, it is particularly brutal. And this rape of Nanjing actually happens before World War II officially begins. But you can see how in this one city, people are just killed, raped, tortured, murdered. It's really brutal. So this is another human rights violation that happens in the same era. Technically, it's before World War II, but you should just be aware of this. All right, and with that, I am going to close World War II, and the next topic will be the Cold War.